Okay, thank you everybody for making some time today to join in. Um, and I realize everyone's working from home, so you probably didn't have to travel too far to do this. So thank you. Um, we are obviously meeting in some unusual circumstances today. Coronavirus is obviously um, hijacked and manipulated the way we operate on our personal lives, professional lives, and whatnot. So thank you for making some time. I'm guessing heading into the second week of these folk quarantines, this may come as a welcome respite to some people, and if that's the case, I'm sorry. But I guess we should just get started. So first, I just want to thank Alex and Satya and Patrick Haley and the entire Quorum team for inviting me to do this. Just a little bit of background briefly about me. My name is Phil Singer. I run a company called Marathon Strategies. We are based in New York, Albany, and DC, and we are a full-service communications and public affairs firm that operates in a variety of industries, spaces, and whatnot. We put a big emphasis on our research practice and generating original content, all in an effort to inform the various multi-channel communications programs that we put together on behalf of our clients. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how the dynamics of the political campaign for president is impacting the ways companies, nonprofits, other organizations communicate with stakeholders in DC, and frankly, stakeholders at all levels of government. We are in a somewhat unique time right now in the sense that I gave this talk about a month ago, and circumstances were obviously dramatically different. And I think one of the big shifts that's taken place, obviously coronavirus is the big shift, but one of the interesting dynamics of that is that in many respects, we've gone back to the future in the sense that coronavirus is somewhat evocative of the environment that corporate America and advocates found themselves in post-2008, where this cataclysmic event, whether it's in the form of the Great Recession of '08 or whatever we're going to end up calling this latest period of economic trouble in 2020, it will, in theory, inform everything that we all do as communicators going forward for the foreseeable future. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how coronavirus has impacted those communications, but really we're going to focus the bulk of our time today on just the macro shifts that have taken place over the course of the last decade and what that means for how we go about communicating with elected officials. So using the 2020 campaign as a point of departure, sorry, we're having a little bit of a minor technical issue in terms of advancing this. There we go. Using the 2020 campaign as a point of departure for this exercise, one of the things that's happened over the last several years, post 2008, is that there's been an overall decline in public trust in institutions like Congress, the White House, our politics, even larger institutions like companies, remain looked at warily by the general public. And so what's ended up happening is that I think there's always been a little bit of cynicism on the part of voters with regard to what politicians say and do while they're campaigning. But that disconnect is, remarkably pronounced today. So, generally people think that, if a candidate gets up on the campaign trail and says they're going to do X, Y, or Z, that it's a lot of hot air. But the reality is that over the course of the last 50 years or so, if you look back and do the research, most presidents make at least a good faith effort to advance the agenda that they campaign on. And I think, given the rise of technology, of citizen journalism, YouTube, and other platforms, there is heightened accountability on the part, for what politicians need to do once they get into office. Back in the old days, you could campaign on something. There wouldn't be a daily rat-a-tat-tat as to whether or not you were upholding your commitments. Today there is. And you don't have to look very far to see this in action. Whether it's Obama campaigning on a healthcare issue, the first thing he did when he got into office was do healthcare. Trump talking about trade. A lot of people dismissed that as campaign rhetoric, but sure enough, we've been embroiled in a fairly significant trade war over the last 3 years. So it's important to pay attention to what politicians are saying when they're campaigning, and to adjust your planning accordingly. Everything is online, so it's that much harder for candidates to weasel out of their promises the way they might have once done. I think one of the other major changes that has taken place over the course of just even the last 10 years or 12 years is that the way campaigns and elected officials consume news and make news has dramatically shifted. Back in the old days, you might get a fax newsletter once a week from somebody covering politics in a given state. That's a dinosaur. I mean, when I was getting ready for this, I made a joke to some of my colleagues that there's probably at least a dozen people on this webinar right now that have never heard of a fax machine. The reality is that you've got more news coming in than ever before, whether it be a Mike Allen Axios morning roundup to a podcast to the ongoing rat-a-tat-tat of cable news, whatever it is. Breaking through is as hard as it's ever been. And I think, given this oversaturation, there are implications for how we go about communicating to elected officials, as well as how elected officials go about communicating to us. Back in 2009, 2010, something like, a third of members of Congress were using social media. Today, it's ubiquitous. Everybody's on it. Everybody, the more talented ones have been able to figure out how to deliver news and bypass traditional media using Twitter, Facebook and whatnot. It's not to say that old media is dead, just that there are other outlets by which elected officials can communicate. Similarly, those same platforms are available to companies and advocacy groups and nonprofits, and they can use those as well to not just communicate to elected officials, but to name check them themselves. This brave new world has created a lot of a new reality or a new normal for companies operating in this space. So what does all this mean? I think to sort of sum it up in a nutshell, we've all heard the phrase the permanent campaign as it relates to the way elected officials conduct themselves. But today, it's not just elected officials that have to run that permanent campaign. It's corporations, it's nonprofits, it's advocacy groups. You have to always be on and running these round-the-clock, multi-front, comms programs in order to stay relevant. And as we get into this in a little bit, to talk about the character of your organization, because a lot of that communications activity will reflect who you are as a company, your values and whatnot. And with the rise of cause capitalism, that is exceedingly important to protect your, to communicate in order to protect yourself from unwanted scrutiny, unwanted regulation, and whatnot. So it's fair to say that businesses face a fairly significant uphill battle as we navigate this new space. As I was saying earlier, 2008 really opened up the floodgates to the populism that we're experiencing now. Obviously, populism is not a new thing. It's been going on since the era of William Jennings Bryan. at the turn of the century. But I think in the wake of 2008, you didn't really see it flare that much during that campaign because the economic crisis hit towards the end. But you certainly saw it in 2010 with the advent of the Tea Party. And then during the 2012 presidential race, Obama, based a large part of his campaign with regard to disqualifying Mitt Romney on his tenure at Romney's tenure at Bain Capital. And so, 4 years later, that became a bipartisan or a bipartisan exercise where on the Democratic side, you had during the primary, fights between Sanders and Clinton over her ties to Wall Street. But you also saw on the Republican side, Donald Trump going after Ted Cruz for his relationship with Goldman Sachs, for example, and just an overall skepticism among the electorate around these big institutions, these big companies. And so now we forward into the current time, and name checking companies has become bipartisan, standard fare, almost table stakes to be considered in primary campaigns. I'm going to play a little video illustrating this point of how it's playing out in 2020. Obviously, the primaries are winding down, but this was in full effect. So everybody should you obviously have the volume on your computers turned up, hopefully, otherwise I'm talking to myself here. But
Amazon, Google,
General Motors, from McDonald's, Purdue Pharma,
about Apple,
McDonald's, Amazon,
Facebook, McDonald's,
Walmart, Johnson & Johnson, Samsung, Apple.
They buy you out before you have a chance to get started.
So the long and short of it is that companies have become proxies for larger economic or societal challenges, and that's part of the primary playbook, whether you're a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate. We counted up from the last 6 months of 2019, 80 companies from across 30 different industries got called out, and that's a significant shift because back in the day, even 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you might hear candidates calling out an industry. Maybe the oil industry was reaping significant profits, and there would be criticism of the industry. There would rarely, there are some exceptions certainly, but it certainly was not as uniform as it is today, where individual companies would get called out. That's a significant change. And I think what's most significant about it is the downstream effect that it creates. So even if you're not being name checked by Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or whomever, the reality is that you very well could. And so that is necessarily informing the way a lot of companies operate during the campaign. I can tell you that, most recently during this current campaign, after Donald Trump got elected, a number of our clients came to us and said, how do we deal with, getting called out on Twitter or, on the campaign trail and whatnot? And we've written, significant numbers of plans focused on helping, companies navigate, through that space. So this is a significant, change from what we've seen in the past. Now, I don't think companies are blind to this. I think they are aware of the fact that this is a new normal. And a lot of this, I think one of the first people to recognize this new reality for, whatever the reason, was Larry Fink. In one of his more recent annual letters, he talked about how we need to, how other metrics besides shareholder value needs to start informing the way corporations operate. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. When you have trillions of dollars invested, throughout the country and the world, people are going to listen to what you have to say. And one of the major players that listened to what he had to say was the Business Roundtable, who last year changed its statement around the purpose of a corporation to go beyond simply focusing on shareholder value, sort of saying, Milton Friedman, it's time for you to, go off to the side, and we need to look at these other metrics. And I think these things are more than just semantics, because if you start expanding what corporate purpose means to include operations, how you spend your money, how you manage an activist investor, that has real, effects in terms of the way the overall company is operating. It's not simply a communications exercise, but it's an operational exercise that is being influenced. Fortunately, I think that there are a lot of ways for companies to respond to this new situation and to adapt. A couple of examples of companies that I've seen do a really good job of this: Patagonia, John Deere, Home Depot, Walmart, have all focused on figuring out ways to link what they do as a business to some greater good. And they've done that well. And I think the trick is, you don't want to be talking the talk. You want your company or your organization to be walking the walk. Now, obviously, this is more applicable to the corporate space than to the advocacy space, but there are a lot of different tools that are out there that will allow you to communicate what you're doing on these fronts. And I think, again, I don't want to, I guess we're on a Quorum webinar, so it's okay for me to sound like an infomercial for them, but I think Quorum does a really good job of having tools that will allow you to communicate what you're doing, so that companies understand what you've got going on and how you're operating. Now, having said all of this, and I think this is one thing, just that on the given that we're living in the era of COVID-19, I think this is a particularly important point to take hold, because just as in 2009, 2010, 2011 even, everything that everybody did was pegged to the economic recovery. The next few years are going to see a similar dynamic at play, where everything that a company is trying to communicate is linked to its response to how the country and how it's helping the country, get past this current economic situation and public health situation. And so, you got to be really, cognizant of that, and start thinking about ways to communicate that as you, build out your various programs. Having said all of this, there is no, it's not an easy task. There's still, a significant number of risks that can remain. And, I think one of the things that I think we'll see more of over the course of the next several years is the marriage of public affairs, CSR, ESG, whatever you want to call it, with communications and operations, where, years ago, some of these functions might have been siloed from one another. I think they're going to increasingly work hand in hand. So if you want to advance an issue management program or a public affairs program, what you do from the CSR perspective is going to be exceedingly important towards validating some of the things that you're talking about. If the number one external risk, aside from consumer demand declining, is overregulation, then it's going to be that much more important to really communicate the character of your company and the values that you work by, to prevent a member of Congress or a regulator from implementing some sort of draconian measure. So that could hurt you. So, and I think this is also particularly true on on the coronavirus. If you have ideas or things that you want to be doing, you should absolutely be getting out there and being proactive. Sitting on the side and hoping that nobody will notice you in this environment, I don't think is tenable, because from a media perspective, the demand for news is so overwhelming that reporters are going to be looking for stories, and better to be feeding them the story than having them hoist one on you that you might not want. So these things are, we're in a complicated environment here, and the sooner you start preparing for it is key, and really expanding the way you think about these issues, because policy fights that might not directly impact your bottom line may suddenly become more relevant to you. And we'll talk a little bit about an example of something like that towards the end of this, this discussion. So how do we go about developing the winning strategy? And I think this is really where the permanent campaign comes into play. In the old days, you wait for a candidate to get sworn in, and then you go out and lobby them. There's historically been an overwhelming deference to incumbents. 90% of PAC donations go to incumbents as opposed to their challengers. But today, as we discussed earlier, the ideas that are shaped on the campaign trail are increasingly informing what candidates actually do once they get elected. And I think this is particularly true for those in executive positions. So we have a system that we like to use, a matrix, if you will, that allows us to, try to, develop programs or develop and identify the ideal times to develop programs and implement them that will influence the way an issue plays out. And if you look at the policy life cycle, the ideal time to shape an issue is when it's in its embryonic phase. Just as it's emerging, but before it's become completely politicized, and certainly well before it's been converted into legislative language or a rule or a regulation and whatnot. Once it gets into that point, you can still influence it, of course, but it becomes that much more difficult to do so. And so I think Quorum also does a good job of complementing this sort of matrix, because the key thing to any situation like this is having an early alert system in place so that what people are saying, who their networks are, how to influence them, how to get on their radar before we get into the legislative or direct engagement phase, and before it's too late. And I know that there are a variety of tools and devices that Quorum has. Patrick Cayley, who's on with me, can answer any questions once we get to the Q&A phase on this. But I think they do a really good job. We use them ourselves for this type of function, but they do a good job of helping everybody stay apprised of what people are saying. So once you've identified the issue, how do you go about operationalizing a game plan to influence it? And I think that there are generally three elements to a successful communications program. One is content, one is voices, one is distribution. And these are the basics. Content is relatively self-explanatory, but if you are putting out a CSR report, if you have an issue that you want to weigh in on, maybe putting together a white paper, laying out that issue, quantifying its effect. If you're a reinsurance company, for example, and you're worried about the impact of climate change on and the impact of hurricanes on a given area, you might put out a white paper laying out the various ways the federal government should improve upon how it manages disaster response and preparation. You then want to take that type of content, identify the best voices to articulate and amplify it, whether they be internal to your organization or external. It's usually a good idea to try to get a combination of those elements. You want to get a chorus of voices validating what your organization is promoting, but identifying and lining those folks up as soon as possible and cultivating relationships with them so that they're not coming into it cold and that they understand the character of your organization is key. And then finally, distribution. In this digital era in which we're living, distribution has become, I think, arguably the most important thing when it comes to this trifecta of elements, because there are so many different types of analytics tools and proprietary technologies that are available that will allow you to quietly target certain people, broadly target other, mass populations or audiences. And so having a strong sense of what those distribution options are is key to helping you maximize the reach of your message. And I think, one thing that's important to keep in mind, it's, despite the fact that we're living in this digital era, old media is not dead. So news organizations are as relevant today as they've ever been. But the crucial difference is that that their content really is online now. Sure, you can get the print edition of the New York Post or the Washington Post or the Times, whatever it is, and you read it, but then you throw out the paper and it's gone. But those stories that you're reading are all living online somewhere. And to the extent that people aren't reading the print edition and reading the online version, you want to make sure that they're seeing it. And given the extraordinary plethora of news organizations and content manufacturers, if you will, that are pushing content out, there's this the oversaturation of news means that companies and organizations have a greater burden when it comes to figuring out smart ways to distribute their content so that they're able to maximize the odds of their audiences reading the things that they want them to read. So this is something that is increasingly important, but being able to control that digital town square is, I think, table stakes. If it's not table stakes yet, it will be table stakes very, very soon. I would argue that it is table stakes, but it's key to getting your message out. And final thing I'll say on this is there are sometimes, we deal with a lot of clients that have an issue that they're worried about, they want to talk about, but they don't necessarily want to promote broadly. Using digital tools allows you to avoid what they call as the Streisand effect, where Barbara Streisand, I always screw up the story a little bit, but Barbara Streisand had a neighbor who was building some monstrosity of a house next to her, and she made a big deal about it. And suddenly, with the neighbor, and suddenly Page Six picked it up, and a couple of other gossip columns picked it up, and suddenly got out of her control and became a huge issue. And so you want to avoid that type of situation. I know when I worked on the Kerry campaign, for example, in 2004, there was a lot of concern about pushing back on the Swift boat attacks. In hindsight, that was a mistake for obvious reasons, since John Kerry didn't become president. Of course, it was a mistake if you were voting for John Kerry, not if you were voting for George Bush. But I wonder how that would have played out if that issue had come up today, because there are other ways to go about responding to unwanted scrutiny and unwanted attacks without blowing them up in such a way as to have everybody suddenly learn about those problems. So how do we go about operationalizing a lot of these things? Again, you want to have a good media mix of what you're doing in the digital space. You want to be thinking about display ads, social ads, social activity, not necessarily ads, native advertising. TV is not dead, but you want to make sure that you balance it out. I think that there are probably that the most cost-effective way to do a lot of these activities is via digital platforms, given the fact that increasing majorities are getting their news exclusively through online audiences. So in terms of trying to put some paint on the canvas here, I wanted to flag, one example from the 2016 campaign that I thought was interesting, which was, when Trump was campaigning, he often would go after Ford Motor Company and, would imply that they were leaving Michigan, that they were outsourcing their operations and whatnot. And Ford did a really great job of, incorporating this trifecta of voices, of content, voices, and distribution in preparation for, the debates. And sure enough, at the Hofstra debate, the first debate of the general election in the 2016 campaign, Trump repeated his attack on Ford, and Ford was ready. They had outside voices in the form of the UAW to go out and say this is not true. We are locked into Michigan and have commitments for them. They had their content was already laid out and ready to roll. They had infographics. You don't look, everybody, I'm sure a lot of people on the phone are familiar with how an infographic gets produced. It doesn't get produced in real time during a debate. These things have to be done in advance. And they were ready to roll with that. And then they were, doing a great job on the rapid response piece, responding to reporters and others that might be tweeting or asking questions and whatnot. And as a result of that planning and preparation, they were able to shape the news coverage, with regard to Ford the next day. And so instead of having a headline that said Trump attacks Ford during debate, it was Ford fights back against Trump debate claims. And so, I think that underscores the value of planning and being ready for, whatever might be coming your way. One issue which I think is, certainly on the, on the cusp of becoming a major issue, some might argue that it already is data privacy. Most people are familiar with the California data privacy bill. It's fairly significant, far-reaching, but that's just one state. The internet is not restricted to state by state. It's a global beast, as it were. And so there's going to have to be a broader piece of legislation that covers how data is protected, how it's used, and whatnot. And that's going to have repercussions for a variety of different industries, some of which you wouldn't intuitively associate with, with data privacy. And so to my earlier point about how the issues that people talk about on the campaign, can come back to become an issue for your company on matters that you would least expect. This is one where we know it's coming. It hasn't really been crystallized. Senator Gillibrand has a bill. I think Senator Cassidy has proposed something as well. But there hasn't really been a lot of work done on this, one in part because of the presidential campaign that was going on up until coronavirus hit, and now because of coronavirus. But I would bet anything that by the time we get into 2021, certainly, and hopefully get past this latest coronavirus situation, this is going to become that much more important. So whether you're in healthcare, finance, whatever the issue, retail, you need to start thinking about, how you want to shape a data privacy bill and start communicating, with lawmakers start as soon as possible to start, educating them about how you might be impacted through all of this. And then, the final thing I'd like to just, say briefly with regard to coronavirus is, for the last several months during the Democratic primary, we've heard a lot of conversation around paid sick leave, flexible leave policies, other workforce issues. I think a lot of those issues are going to be more front and center today as we get into this. Once we get past the apex of the spread of the virus, and the public policy response needs to become that much more pronounced, we're going to be hearing a lot more about those types of issues. And I bring that up only because a number of these topics have been discussed at length on the campaign trail. And I would imagine that as the campaign unfolds this year, and then whomever the next president is, whether it's Trump or Biden, or whomever's controlling Congress, there are going to be more pronounced discussions around a lot of those issues. And so it's important to continue to pay attention to what people are saying, because as the major talking point of this presentation is, what people say on the campaign trail usually translates into what they might do in office. So I'd love to take some questions. If you have questions about quorum, Patrick is able to chime in as well, and we can start taking it from there. So hopefully my technical skills are good enough that I will figure out how to open up the Q&A. I think I just click here, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to fire away.
Perfect. The Q&A is at the bottom of the screen for anybody who's listening. We actually got a question through email somehow. So Phil, the question is, when does it make sense to publicly fact check / myth bust? When does it make sense to not fact check /
So this is a great question, and something that we routinely discuss, with clients, prospective clients, whomever else. Our rule of thumb for fact checking is there are facts that are black and white facts. If somebody says the sky is green and the sky is absolutely blue, that is a black and white fact, and you should correct that in real time immediately. And then there are fact checks where there are some shades of gray, where it's not exactly inaccurate, but it could be interpreted and whatnot. I think those are certainly a little bit more complicated and require a bit more nuance with regard to how you go about correcting that. So in a black and white situation, I think it's fine to go be very public in correcting the record. In those shades of gray, I think you need to be a little bit more surgical with regard to engaging. If it's a reporter that's made a shade of gray error, engaging them and explaining that to them why what they're proposing or writing is inaccurate. But using that as the guidance, I think, is the most is a useful way for evaluating when to mix in and when to not. Any other questions? I saw somebody.
Yeah. We have a question in our other chat function. The question is, you previously mentioned using tools to help identify and maximize engagement with audiences to validate our stance on an issue. What are some top tools you would recommend for trying to identify and reach certain audiences that may care about our issue?
Good question. So we have an analytics platform that we use that allows us to build out custom audiences of the people that we're trying to reach. So for example, if you want to hit, if you're working on let's just say a cannabis issue, recreational cannabis legalization campaign, and you've identified law and order types who vote, who care about, who are libertarians and don't want the government in your way, you can use a platform like Signal or Resonate, to take advantage of their survey data and extrapolate an audience that reflects those types of attributes. And then once you have that data in place, you can serve your content to them and your messaging to those folks in a way that, hopefully will, resonate with them and result in them being active on your behalf. And so, that's why I continue to be amazed at how many major companies are somewhat, wary about allowing their public affairs budgets to invest in these types of services, either through a vendor like, Marathon or other vendors. But they are so important to making sure that you're communicating to the right people at the right time without over communicating to a broader audience. And I think the value of those types of services is an analogy. I always like to use this analogy, but if you sell vacuum cleaners and you put a billboard up on the side of the highway advertising your vacuum cleaner, you'll be lucky if 1 out of every 1,000 cars that drive by, needs to buy a vacuum cleaner. With these tools, you can put your vacuum cleaner advertisement on a highway that is driven by people who are interested in vacuum cleaners. I strongly recommend looking into companies like Resonate, who can provide these analytics tools so that you're able to custom make these types of audiences and then communicate accordingly. All right, I see that people are populating the question window here, so I will read a few. We have an anonymous question. Although the campaign is permanent, are there other principles to be used in maintaining / discarding social media posts so that they do not come back to bite the company? Well, I think the first way to answer that question is to have a system in place that allows you to vet what's going up so that you don't have to worry about something coming back to bite the company. Having a vetting process in place and having a diverse workforce, I think, is key here. Having a diversity of positions and roles that are part of the evaluation chain are key so that a mistake doesn't get made. Simply running, if you're running, just generic, retweets of a news article or whatever else, that's not that big of a deal. But if you're making some sort of operational announcement or a significant personnel change, whatever else, making sure that you touch base with your general counsel, your operations folks, your HR department, whatever the relevant entities are within your organization, to make sure that everybody is on board with that post and that all of the ways it could blow back on you are contemplated. I think that with regard to social media, it's important to keep in mind that social media is not an end unto itself. It has to be part of a broader and integrated communications program such that it's an extension of whatever you're doing. So for example, when we write out a communications program, we'll have we'll set up a grid and we'll have the main thesis of whatever it is that we're trying to drive in a given moment. But then we'll have subsets. So what are we doing for traditional or earned media? What are we doing on the paid media side? What are we doing on the social media side? And that whole universe of activity is factored into the final product. And these questions get vetted in the course of developing that plan. So that's key. Once something goes up online, for better or for worse, it lives forever. So you see people taking a tweet down or things like that. There are ways to retrieve that content through things like the Wayback Machine, so it's not gone forever. Now, I think one tool and one thing that you can use, which may help get around some of that, is the story function on Instagram, for example, or other social platforms that have disappearing functions included in them. But what do you call it? But those have their drawbacks as well. But those are some ways to protect yourself. But ultimately, the best thing you can do is really smart and clever planning. I hope that answers your, hopefully that answers your question. Another question we have is from somebody named Jody. I'll keep her last name out of it in case she doesn't want that broadcast. For advocacy groups with limited budgets for political communications, and in light of the coronavirus preventing on-the-ground tactics like canvassing, what are some tools we should prioritize for campaign work for 2020? Good question. Believe it or not, digital advertising is a lot cheaper, or can be a lot cheaper than more traditional advertising. And so figuring out I think, in a situation like this is really where content becomes king. Because if you have great content and it's compelling and interesting, then it only takes a little bit of money to get that out into your networks and broadcast. And so, I think that's a situation where you shift the focus to developing really smart and compelling materials that will resonate with folks and, get that out there. I think it's also important to take advantage of whatever organizing you've done in the past. If you've built out an email list and a network of folks on your various platforms, and really incorporating a direct appeal to your followers to get them to share your content as a way of making up for a limited budget. But ultimately, not to sound like a dead horse or a broken record, making sure you have compelling materials, whether they be infographics, it could be, it doesn't always have to be something, you don't have to always have all the bells and whistles. You could have a really great op-ed that's saying something that's significant, and getting that around, can have an impact. But I think this comes down to, when times are good and we're not in, a situation like we're in now, trying to build up your following as much as you can so that you're able to deploy accordingly.
Phil, one question I've heard was, we've heard a lot about when negative communication stuff comes out, but what happens when suddenly somebody says something really positive about your organization? How do you capitalize on that moment?
Well, first you say thank you. Again, taking advantage of your various platforms to promote it, but also reaching out to whomever is, making this point, and seeing if they will, look, you don't get anything if you don't ask for it. So asking folks to, that might say something laudatory about you, I think is step one, getting them to post on all their various platforms. Step two is making sure that you're reposting whatever they've posted, if they've done it on social, to make sure that gets out there. I think step three is doing outreach to various reporters under the table and saying, heads up, I just wanted to make sure you saw what Senator so-and-so said, or what Professor such and such said, or what Advocate X said, and seeing if you can generate some coverage around that. Given the voluminous number of news aggregators now, whether it be Playbook, Mike Allen, whomever it is, whispering to some of those folks that somebody said something about you that's good, can be a way to get that in, especially if it's a counterintuitive voice that is making that comment. Another question, how might a company go about deciding which staffers or advisors are the most important to reach? Good question. Well, look, I think there are two tracks that, you typically will pursue in this. The first track is identifying, which committees and offices are most relevant to whatever issue is you're trying to push out. The second is then engaging in a mapping exercise to figure out, who their network of influencers are. So if you're trying to reach Senator Schumer, and if you've determined that Senator Schumer, for example, is the right person to reach for your issue, start mapping out who on his staff is the right person to, work on that issue, and then look into who their influencers are, both at the staff level as well as at the member level. So if Senator Schumer is best friends with, corporate CEO X, or the head of Planned Parenthood, or I'm just throwing out random ideas here, but whomever it is, engage them and see if they're already copacetic with your issue, and see if they'll whisper to them. The same principle is true with regard to the staffer level. And once you've put together that influencer map or tree, and I believe, Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Quorum can help you with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
You then start delivering content to the people in that influencer tree, not just digitally, but also, doing things like intercepts. If you know that a fundraiser is happening, that certain people are going to be at, getting them to go in there and communicate to the member or the staffer. If you know that, a certain staffer goes to the gym at a certain time of the morning, quote unquote, bump into them, that sort of thing. And so you just really want to, create that influencer map based on the issue that you're trying to advocate for. I think we have time for a couple of more questions if anybody has any. Okay. Well, I think this has been, I hope that you guys have gotten something out of this. We are always available. If you have any questions, you can reach us at marathonstrategies.com. And certainly the Quorum folks are available to, talk about how they can be of value in terms of, reaching out to relevant people, staying apprised of situations and whatnot. You know, oh, we may have one other question, or maybe not. Oh, we do. I'm sorry. My bad. There's another whole other function. I've been missing stuff. My bad. Adam from the Halo Trust has a question. You previously mentioned using tools to help identify and maximize engagement of audiences to validate our stance on an issue. Oh, I guess we've already, Patrick asked that one.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
Sorry. Good. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Appreciate the thoroughness. So folks, we'll be having a survey at the end of this webinar where you can tell us how we did, whether or not this was helpful for y'all. And then after that, you'll be prompted. Oh, there we go. Nice job, Satya. After that, you can get the recording to this webinar to refer to again. You can always reach out to us via email or visit quorum.us. And we also have a bunch of other webinars we'll be putting out over the next couple of weeks. I believe we have about 4 of them to help your team operate in this space of COVID-19. So thank you, Phil, for joining us. Thank you, Satya, for organizing. And thank you all for attending.
Good deal. Thank you.